And in fact, the system is a selectional system, just like Darwin said. What happens is cells of your body, called lymphocytes, make this antibody, but they modify the ends constantly in terms of the genetic code, so that the ends of any molecule are not like the ends of any other. And then what it does is express it one molecule for each cell. So now let's just take a look at it. Here's the hard part. Clonal selection. This lymphocyte population has one molecule of antibody on the surface waiting. And you see these numbers, they're just indices I put in there. When some foreign molecule comes, it will find some that fit better than others because there are billions of them, okay, like keys and locks. And so it comes along, and when it binds one of them sufficiently, it will cause the cell to divide and make more of that kind. So the next time around, you're immune. Got it? The idea is variation, which is in the antibody molecule, selection, which is in the cells that carry them, each one in one, and those which are selected are the ones that are procreated, if you will, or cell division makes more. So you're now prepared. Well, it so turns out that the nervous system works in a similar way, but it does not do it according to the same elements. Higher brains are also selectional systems. This is called neural Darwinism. And the idea is the following, that instead of antibodies, what it has is these circuits that I mentioned the numbers of, myriad circuits, little microcircuits of connections amongst all the different nerve cells that I mentioned. And some of those circuits are selected over others. But instead of multiplying, what it does is it strengthens the connections or the synapses of those that work best. So it selects among a repertoire of different circuits those that seem to fit the input as it is occurring in each case. Now, in that same sense, no two individuals do it the same way, even if they say the same things, do the same things, or are subjected even to scientific study. So selection occurs by differential change in these connection strengths between neurons. Now what I'd like to do is show you that the computer is not a good model, but it's an excellent tool, and say that at the Neurosciences Institute, my colleagues and I have been working on trying to evince some of these properties by making models. A very useful scientific trait. They're not exactly true, but they're enough to stimulate thought. So I'm going to show you a model of perception, a visual perception involving what's called a gestalt. And what I'm going to show you is this, that if we slow the whole thing down so you can see it, what happens is the selection causes certain of these populations to fire synchronously and form something as if it were made by design. But of course it is not. So in fact, what I'd like to do now is turn to the video. And this is a video in which we model integration in the visual system by grouping a gestalt. The stimulus is a figure and a coherent background. Here's the coherent background. Now I make a figure by moving, and I send this into the model in a supercomputer. And watch what happens to these nerve cells. They're, of course, 100 times slower than what's happening in your brains right now. So here are the groups of neurons that are firing electrically, and they are indeed electrochemical structures, on and off, communicating. But notice what happens with time, with relatively short times. Pretty soon, a coherent set of neurons are firing together. We've selected certain circuits that correspond to the input, not as you write it down, but in terms of a transform relating to space and time. I thought you'd want to look at that because it bears on what I'd like to try out with you out of the, how shall I say, not quite shame of the original invitation by Milton, in which I was embarrassed to know that I was totally ignorant of art criticism and art history. So I read Gombrich, and I read Arnheim, and I read, I guess Sir Herbert Reed, and I read Dutton, and I came away satisfied at one level, but dissatisfied at another. There was no brain model. And so what I'd like to do is propose a brain model, and that means coming back to mind. Now I'm going to talk about mind in terms of William James, the great American psychologist and philosopher, who said, consciousness is a unitary form of awareness that changes in time, is a process, not a thing, reflects subjective feelings, qualia, and is shifted by attention. And the main thing is that it evolved in order for animals to be able to, in a certain sense, predict and anticipate future events. We all know what it is, you know. It is what you lose when you fall into a deep dreamless slumber and what you get back when you wake up. Or if you prefer that, I'll tell you an anecdote involving myself, the only major surgery I had in my life. the anesthesiologist looked at me on the gurney while I was looking at the fluorescent lights, and he said, you know, Dr. Edelman, I read one of your books. I don't understand this idea of reentry. Could you explain this to me? I looked at the tubes that were in me, and I said, well, okay, I try. And about 6 minutes later, he said, you know, you've done it. Now we're going to have to say goodbye to each other for a while. Bingo. Well, so here we go. So let's talk about what that means. The first thing that it means is that, in a way, your brain is taking the outside and turning it into something inside, in which it speaks to itself in myriad fashions, because the dimensionality of consciousness is huge. While I'm here, you're conscious of the seat you're sitting in, of the other people, of the shouts of elation that you justifiably have in this rite of passage, all of this. The fact is, it's unitary, though. It's a whole scene, isn't it? And you have that in terms of this diagram that I showed you before. But if you look down at the bottom, at perception and memory, I proposed, in fact, that what gives rise to consciousness and evolution is the fact that the circuits involved in perception are connected up with those of memory, so as to take the outside and put it inside so it talks to itself. Now that's an analogy, because you don't really talk when you have so-called primary consciousness. And we'll get to that, but what I want to show you is, in fact, there can be done a series of experiments that sort of support this idea without absolutely proving it. And I think it's very important to point out that we have a debt of gratitude to physicists for making these so-called superconductivity electrodes that can measure the magnetic accompaniment of the electrical activity of these neurons I'm talking about. So here's the experiment we did. First of all, this machine is so sensitive, you must put the person in a room that's totally shielded. Let me show you an example of this hairdryer, which has 148 different electrodes of this kind all over the brain, detecting the magnetic fields that accompany all those actions. Now what we do is we show them, alternatively, we show them red vertical lines and blue horizontal lines at right angles. And the fact is, they have red lens in this eye and blue lens in that eye, so the symbols are going into the brain. But in fact, the brain can't put them together. Right angles is too much. Spatial vision, you can do it, but with right angles, it's too much. So what the brain does is called binocular rivalry. You, in fact, either see red or nothing, or blue, or red, or blue, back and forth. And we have the person report which one they see and which one they're conscious of. We measure the corresponding effects on these electrodes, and we do some fancy math. And what we come up with is sort of exciting. It is this, that as you see from the different intensity curves in the color chart on the right, you see different areas of the brain lighting up or not. But more importantly than that, concurrent with what I showed you in the video, at this higher level of consciousness, whenever they become conscious, all those neuronal elements that are linked by blue lines are firing simultaneously. And that is now a deep characteristic of the scientific study of consciousness, which has just really discovered energy in the last decade or so. It used to be the province of philosophers. It still is to some degree. And I only remind those of you who think about that of what Samuel Johnson, the great lexicographer, said in Boswell's Life. He said, I had a friend who thought to go into philosophy, but cheerfulness kept breaking in. So here we have this hypothesis to face us right now. In order to do it, what we have to do is distinguish the forms of consciousness. The consciousness I've been talking about is so-called primary consciousness. It's the experience of a unitary scene in a period of most seconds, which I've called the remembered present. But there's no consciousness of being conscious. The animal doesn't have a symbol system. Unlike us, our hominid background leads to a symbolic species that communicates these symbols by way of speech. And given speech, consciousness of consciousness becomes feasible because you're no longer hooked to the outside input, you're hooked to the tokens of speech inside. And so you can construct present and future narratives in detail, and you can report, and etc. It doesn't rule out primary consciousness, but it just says you have to have both. To give you a cruel example of what this means, let me say this. If you kick a dog, the next time he sees you, he may bite you or run away. but he doesn't sit around plotting to remove your tenure. And now I've come to my condensation and my hypothesis. It is this, and this is from someone who starts from ignorance. I must excuse myself. Visual art, I believe, is a modality-specific form of higher-order consciousness. Like speech, it is something possessed by us, like language. It's driven by symbolic communication and is unique to our species. You can have bowerbirds and you can have beavers, but you don't have the kind of thing that you people all represent in terms of creativity and expressivity and witnessing of each other's work. This is something that's quite human and is intercalated with this higher order consciousness of speech, but is a separate arena. And it's interesting to me that although speech is to some degree ambiguous, the domain of art is truly deeply ambiguous, and that's not a defect. The defect is not there. In fact, you need the ambiguity in order to make the associations. And so what I would say to you is, being embedded in this selective system of neural Darwinism, it's endless in its possibilities. Consider these endless repertoires in each one of your potential, and consider this, that what you should do, I believe, is take pleasure in the endless number of possibilities in your craft and your art, and second of all, take even greater pleasure in producing things and seeing things of the kind that involves selection on your part based on your experiences, which have been so rich in this profound school. So finally, let me say to you, rejoice. And having done that, listen to the master, Milton, who says, do good work. Godspeed. Thank you.
Now it is my honor to introduce to you a member of the Board of Directors of the School of Visual Arts, Joseph F. Patterson.
Dr. Edelman, sir, for the significance of your outstanding contributions to biophysics, protein chemistry, immunology, cell biology, and neurobiology, for the ingenuity to invest reason, observation, and experience with the most elevated level of scientific majesty and magnitude, for your discerning investigations into the genesis of learning and the origins of memory and feelings, for the prepossessing singularity of your explorations into the links between consciousness, causation, evolution, and the development of self. For these accomplishments and many others, the School of Visual Arts confers upon you its highest award, the degree of Doctor of Fine Arts.